A friend of mine had just signed his third set of divorce papers. He looked older than he really was. Not from age, but from exhaustion. Like someone who had been running a marathon he never meant to enter. While he went inside to pay the tab, I watched the couples walking by, laughing, holding hands, still believing their story would be different. It hit me then. If marriage was supposed to make men stronger and happier, why are so many men walking away from it now? It is not just a few anymore. Across the country, men are quietly stepping back. Some never propose. Some never move in. Some stay in long relationships but keep one foot outside the door, just in case. It is not fear of love. It is about reading the fine print of a deal that no longer makes sense. When I was younger, everyone said marriage was the mark of a real man. You get a job, meet someone nice, settle down, build a family. That was the promise. Our fathers made it look easy, maybe even noble. But something changed between their generation and ours. The rules stayed the same, but the meaning shifted. Back then, marriage was a partnership built on survival. Two people needed each other. Today, we live in a world where independence is not only possible but expected. So what happens when a system built for another time keeps running on autopilot? Men begin to question it. And when they do, society calls them immature, afraid, selfish. But what if that hesitation is not fear? What if it is awareness? I used to think avoiding marriage was a sign of failure. Now I think it might be a sign of clarity. Because when you watch enough good men lose everything they built, you start to wonder what the reward really is. A friend once told me, half joking, half broken, that getting married is like signing a contract you did not write, with penalties you cannot negotiate, and the other party has a lawyer you pay for. I laughed at first, but he was right. He had worked 20 years to build a life, and with one signature, half of it was gone. He said the house was just wood and walls, but the silence afterward was heavier than any mortgage. People like to say men have changed. Maybe that is true, but marriage has changed too. It used to be a bond. Now it feels like a bet. And the odds do not look good anymore. Most men do not talk about it. They just adjust quietly. They stop bringing up weddings. They stop dreaming about walking down an aisle. They learn to live in the in-between. Long relationships. No ring. No papers. No risk. To some people that looks cold. But for many men, it looks like survival. It is not that we have stopped believing in love. We just stopped believing that love needs a certificate from the state to make it real. There is a picture that stays in my head. A man sits alone at his kitchen table, staring at a photo of his kids. He does not hate anyone. He does not regret loving. But he cannot understand how loving someone turned into losing everything that made him who he was. That is when I realized something important. Men are not running from women. They are running from a system that stopped protecting both sides. They are tired of being told that sacrifice is strength while silence is virtue. Every time I talk to older men, I hear the same story. They did what they were supposed to do. They worked hard, provided, stayed loyal, and still ended up starting over at 50. Some live in small apartments, counting days until they can see their kids again. Some rebuild. Some give up. All of them carry the same question inside. Was it worth it? That question is what nobody wants to talk about, because to admit that marriage might not work for everyone feels like betrayal. Betrayal of tradition, of religion, of the story we were raised on. But ignoring it has not made it go away. If anything, the silence made the wound deeper. When I see men my age staying single, I do not see immaturity. I see reflection. I see caution born from experience. It is not bitterness. It is realism. Marriage was built for a time when roles were fixed, when expectations were clear, when the law did not tilt so heavily to one side. Now everything is different. Men and women both work. Both can live independently. But the structure of marriage has not caught up. It still punishes failure as if love were a financial contract, not a human bond. That is what breaks people. Not love itself, but the system that turns heartbreak into paperwork. I once asked my father if he ever thought about remarrying after mom passed. He smiled, the tired kind of smile that carries a story behind it, and said, "Son, Once you've seen how the system treats men my age, you think twice about signing anything again. He was not bitter when he said it. He was calm, almost peaceful, like someone who had finally understood something the world refuses to admit. The more I think about it, the more I see that men today are not confused. They are conscious. They know the cost of commitment, not just emotionally, but legally and financially. And when you know the cost, you make different choices. That is not cowardice. That is maturity. Still, there is something sad about it. Because underneath all the logic, there is a quiet kind of grief. The grief of knowing something sacred was lost along the way. The idea that love and law could coexist without fear. That a promise could mean more than paperwork. I miss believing in that. I think many of us do. Maybe that is why the question stays. Not because we have stopped loving, but because we are still trying to understand how love became so complicated. If you ask me why men do not want to get married anymore, I would say this. It is not rejection. It is reflection. Men are not refusing love. They are just trying to protect what little peace they have left. I once heard someone say that marriage is not really about love. It is about law. At first, I brushed it off. It sounded cynical, like something you would hear from a man who lost too much in a divorce. But the older I get, the more I see how close that statement is to the truth. We talk about vows and forever. Yet behind all that romance sits a pile of paperwork, waiting to decide who gets what when it all falls apart. Most men never read the fine print. We are raised to believe that love will protect us. We do not think about courts, lawyers, or alimony when we are standing at the altar. We think about trust. We think about family. But when trust breaks, the system does not deal in feelings. It deals in dollars, in custody rights, in who moves out and who stays in the house you both paid for. I have watched men walk into courtrooms as husbands and walk out as visitors in their own children's lives. It does something to you. It chips away at your sense of self. You start to question everything you believed about being a man, a provider, a father. You realize how fragile your place in the story really is. The fine print is not written in small letters. It is written in assumptions. Assumptions that men will provide. That they will stay no matter what. That they will keep giving even when the love is gone. And if they do not, the system steps in to remind them of their obligations. Somewhere along the way, partnership turned into performance. And love became something you had to prove by constantly sacrificing more than you can afford. There was a time I believed that strength meant holding everything together. That is what we were taught. Be steady. Be loyal. Take care of your family even when it costs you your peace. But when you live long enough, you start to see that strength can also mean walking away from something that no longer serves you. It can mean protecting yourself before there is nothing left to protect. I remember talking to a friend named Mark. He had been married for 22 years. When it ended, he said something I will never forget. The divorce didn't hurt as much as realizing I had no idea who I was outside of her. That sentence stayed with me. Because that is the real wound men carry. Not just losing someone they loved, but losing the version of themselves they built around that love. Marriage asks men to pour their identity into being a husband and father. And that is beautiful. Until the day it ends. Then you are left with a shell of who you used to be. The job still pays. The bills still come. But the story you lived in is gone. And nobody tells you how to rebuild without it. That is the part nobody sees on social media. You see the jokes about single men living free, but not the quiet nights staring at an empty chair. You see memes about men avoiding commitment, but not the fear of being erased by a system that only calls you when it needs a check. Men are told to toughen up, to move on, to stop complaining. But if you listen closely, under that silence there is exhaustion. Not just emotional, but spiritual. Because marriage used to mean legacy. Now it feels like liability. The fine print says, if things go wrong, love will not save you. The law will decide who you are allowed to be next. Some men never recover from that. Some rebuild with quiet dignity. Some never risk it again. There is a deeper tragedy in all this. It is not that men stopped believing in love. It is that they no longer believe love and safety can exist in the same space. To love now means to risk everything you have. To marry means to sign away control over your own life. That realization does not make men cold. It makes them careful. Still, caution has a cost. You can feel it in the way they talk, in the way they hesitate before trusting someone new. Every scar comes with a story, and every story ends the same way. I thought it would be different. Sometimes I wonder if society really wants men to be happy, or just useful, because everything we are taught about commitment seems designed to measure our worth by how much we can give, not by who we are. That is the quiet identity crisis nobody writes about. The moment a man looks in the mirror after years of doing everything right and realizes he has no idea what right even means anymore. One evening, I visited Mark again. His apartment was small but clean, filled with things he chose himself for the first time in decades. He brewed coffee in silence and said, "I don't miss her. I miss the man I thought I was when I was with her." There was no anger in his voice, only acceptance. Maybe that is what awareness looks like. Not bitterness. Not regret. Just understanding that he had traded pieces of himself for a story that stopped being his long before it ended. That is the heart of the identity check. It is not about blame. It is about realization. Men are starting to see that their value is not tied to a title, or a ring, or the idea of forever. It is tied to presence, to purpose, to peace. Some will still choose marriage. Some will choose solitude. But more and more men are choosing awareness. They read the fine print before signing. They protect their time, their energy, their sanity. They still believe in love. But they have learned to love without losing themselves. And maybe that is not the end of romance. Maybe it is the beginning of a more honest kind of love. There comes a moment in every man's life when he realizes no one is coming to save him. Not the court. Not the system. Not even the love he once believed could last forever. For some, that moment arrives in a quiet apartment after everyone else has gone to sleep. For others, it comes in the middle of the day, standing in line at the grocery store, realizing how long it has been since someone said their name. With warmth, it is a strange kind of peace that follows. The kind that does not announce itself, but simply settles in. It comes when a man stops fighting for something that stopped fighting for him. When he understands that being alone is not the same as being abandoned, it is just another kind of freedom. I have seen that peace in the faces of men who rebuilt themselves. The ones who wake up early, make coffee in silence. They take care of small things they never noticed before. Their lives are simpler now. Smaller maybe, but honest. There is no one to impress. No expectations to perform. Just the slow, the steady rhythm of days that belong entirely to them. Society rarely celebrates that kind of man. We praise the ones who remarry, who move on, who rebuild families. But we forget about the quiet ones who learn to live on their own terms. The ones who found dignity in solitude. They are not bitter. They are not broken. They are simply done pretending that peace is something they have to earn through pain. When I talk to men like that, there is always a softness in their words. They do not talk about revenge or regret. They talk about balance, about finding purpose again. Some started gardening. Some travel alone. Some volunteer at schools or shelters. Some just sit on their porch with a cup of coffee and finally feel okay. I think that is what love turns into when it grows up. It becomes quiet, steady, less about possession, more about presence. The quiet exit is not always a dramatic one. Sometimes it is just a slow walk toward a life that feels lighter. A man decides he does not need to chase approval anymore. He does not need to prove his worth by suffering. He learns that his peace is not selfish. It is survival. That realization changes everything. When you stop trying to fit into a system that was not built for your happiness, you start creating your own. And in that space, something new can grow. Some men meet someone again later in life. A partner who does not want to own them, but to walk beside them. The love is smaller, quieter, but more real. It does not demand proof. It does not ask for sacrifice to the point of emptiness. It simply asks for honesty. That is the kind of love worth keeping. The one that feels like friendship. The one that does not need to be declared in front of witnesses. Because it already speaks in the way you breathe easier around each other. And for those who stay alone, their story is not less. It is simply different. They learn to fill their days with meaning that does not depend on someone else's validation. They learn to listen to their own silence without fear. There is a strange beauty in that. The beauty of self-respect, of choosing peace over pressure, of finding grace in simplicity. Men like that do not hate marriage. They just no longer confuse it with love. They know that love is a choice, not a contract, a practice, not a promise. One day, maybe the world will catch up to that idea. Maybe we will stop asking men when they are getting married and start asking if they are at peace. Because peace, at this age, feels a lot like happiness. I think about my friend Mark sometimes. He still lives alone in that small apartment. The coffee mug is the same. The light hits the same corner of the room every morning. But now there is something different in his eyes. Not sadness. Not anger. Just calm. He told me the other day, "You know, I used to think love meant never being alone. Now I think love means being okay even when you are." That sentence stayed with me. Maybe that is the quiet truth men discover when they stop chasing the old dream. That peace is not the absence of love. It is what remains when love becomes mature enough to stop hurting. If you ask me why men do not want to get married anymore, I would say this. They are not rejecting women. They are rejecting the noise, the expectations, the outdated idea that happiness only counts when someone else signs off on it. Men are simply learning that solitude can be sacred, that love can exist without ownership, that growing old alone is not failure, but freedom. And maybe that is not a loss at all. Maybe it is the beginning of something gentler, because at the end of the day, every man just wants the same thing. Not applause, not validation, just a quiet place to rest his mind, and the freedom to call that peace his own.